Hey everybody, it's Rod with PhotoFair coming back at you with another video. Today, I want to follow up on a blog I did on Couv Camera about 50mm prime lenses. In that blog, I queried, is the 50mm prime past its prime? Well, let's find out. So the 50mm prime, here I've got a 50mm 1.2L EF lens mounted with the adapter on my EOS R. I use 50mm lenses all the time, so clearly I don't think they're past their prime. So what does prime mean? Well, prime just basically means it's not a zoom lens. It's a single focal length lens. Back in the day, prime lenses were notably superior to their zoom lens counterparts. And today, that's not necessarily the case. Today's zoom lenses are so good that really it's not a matter of, ooh, I got to get the prime lens to get the best picture. Typically, a zoom lens is going to give up something in order to give you the freedom of having an extended range. It's either going to be lens speed, or it's going to be size and bulk, or in some cases, a little bit less optical quality. The optical quality issue is no longer a big deal with modern lens design. But back in the day, when I bought my very first 35mm camera, a Canon AE1 in the 70s, back in the Carter administration, basically you always bought one with a 50. I mean, that was like 90% of the people would buy the camera with a 50mm lens. Now, when you were first starting out, it was usually a 1.8 or a 2.0 lens because the 1.4 lenses and faster were really expensive. So I had a Canon AE1 with a 50mm 1.8 lens. Made a lot of great pictures. What I like about the 50mm prime lens is that couple of things. Number one, a 50mm lens gives you kind of sort of a human perspective. You're not really bringing the image closer, you're not magnifying it, you're not wide angle, you're just kind of sort of what your eye sees. And there's some science behind that, and some people say it's more like a 43, others say, it's more like a 55, but in general, a 50 is pretty close to your field of view, excluding peripheral vision. That's kind of nice. It gives us everything we take a picture of with a 50 kind of gives us that perspective as if we were actually looking at it. The other thing that a prime lens in general does is that it forces you to compose your picture. You can't just rack the lens in and out until you frame it the way you want. You kind of have to move around, put your subject in the scene, move the camera. If your subject is movable, move your subject. It makes you think about your composition and your scene a little bit more than just quickly framing it with the zoom lens. I think you're less likely to end up with, a tree coming out of someone's head or a garbage can in the background, or something like that when you have a prime lens, because you're kind of forced to move around and really pay attention to the scene. So I think that just makes you a better photographer having to do that. It doesn't mean that zoom lenses aren't handy to have. They are, but a prime lens can make you a better photographer by forcing you to pay attention to elements in your scene. A couple other things that you really learn about with a prime lens that often you might not with a zoom. Again, with a zoom, you can just kind of zoom in and out and frame the picture the way you want. With a prime lens, you are forced to move closer to your subject or further away from your subject to get the scene the way you want. And this is where perspective comes into play. You start to understand that perspective doesn't change when you change your lens. Perspective changes when you move your camera into a different position relative to your subject. And remember, your background and your subject are independent elements. If I have a background that's a mile behind my subject, and my subject is 20 feet away, if I move 10 feet closer to the subject, I've closed on the subject. I am twice as close to that subject as I was before. But that background that's a mile away really isn't any closer at all, because we're not able to perceive the difference between 5,280 feet and 5,270 feet. Our vision is just not that acute. So the background basically remained the same, relatively speaking, but the subject is now much closer to the camera. So that gives you a perspective change, and that's what perspective change is. In fact, I'm going to show you in this video how lenses don't give you a different perspective at all. It's how close you are to your subject relative to your background and foreground items. That's what changes perspective. And a prime lens kind of forces you to recognize those perspective changes, because instead of zooming from the same camera position where everything remains the same, your subject's 10 feet away, your background's a mile away, and you're just zooming, framing in and out to get it the way you want. You haven't changed your perspective. You've effectively just cropped the picture. Whereas if you physically move your camera closer to your subject or further away from your subject, now you actually change the perspective. And that's something that a prime lens forces you to pay attention to. Take a look at some of these examples here of perspective. I went from 16 to 300, tried to keep the subject the same relative size in the frame, but you'll see a dramatic difference in perspective. And it wasn't because of a telephoto versus a wide angle, it was because of where the camera is relative to the subject, relative to the background. That's what changes the perspective. Take a look. So here you see the 300 millimeter perspective. The camera's real tight, background's completely blurry. You don't really see much of the background. The camera is clearly the subject, and it is prominent and isolated from its surroundings. Now when we go to the 16 shot, I move the camera much closer to the camera. Now the camera is almost the same relative size. It's a little bit smaller because my Canon 16 to 35L wouldn't focus any closer than this. But it's pretty close. But notice the dramatic perspective. I still see a lot of the environment around the camera, even though the camera is still relatively the same size. That's perspective, and it didn't come from the wide angle lens, it came from moving closer to the camera. Yes, the wide angle lens is what allows me to get so much of the background in play, but if I back the camera up, like in this scene right here, the background relative to the camera hasn't changed from the 300 millimeter shot. It's basically the same. The difference is the wide angle lens is simply taking in a bigger field of view. And I even did a shot where I cropped the 16 shot to look just like the 300 shot. Now this is going to get really noisy because I cropped it way down, but just forget about how fuzzy and noisy the shot is. Just look at the perspective between the camera and the background. It's almost the same. Again, other than the fact that the picture lost all of its resolution and quality, it's relatively the same because the camera, it was a 16 millimeter shot taken from the exact same position, exact same subject distance, exact same background distance. And so that's kind of why perspective didn't change much there. Okay, back to the 50. So I think the 50 millimeter prime is a great lens because it gives you that ability to really pay attention to perspective and use perspective to your advantage. Additionally, 50 millimeter lenses are usually really fast. Now this is a 50 millimeter f1.2. It's kind of an expensive lens, but Canon makes a 50 1.4 lens, as does Nikon and Sony, which is much less expensive than the higher speed lens. And you can even get a 50 1.8 from Canon, Nikon, and Sony. And those are even more affordable. You're still getting a lot of the same abilities with the 1.8 as you are with the 1.4 or the 1.2. You can throw the background a little better out of focus, get a little more soft bokeh in the background with the faster lens. And of course you can let more light in for taking low light shots. But in any case, even the cheap nifty 50, as they like to call it for Canon, the 50 1.8, it's a $129 lens, and it's going to be faster than any zoom lens you can buy at any price. That's kind of nice. I think everyone should have a 50 in their kit, even if it's the cheap 50, even if it's the $129 50, the $150 50 millimeter lens. I think they're great. Now, another cool thing about 50s is there's a lot of vintage 50s you can get, like this Zeiss Biotar. I did a video on this lens. The bokeh is beautiful. Look at this shot with the Biotar. Look at that. Isn't that just beautiful? Kind of swirls around the subject. I love this lens. It's a 50 f2, and it's an old classic. Lensbaby makes a macro 50 f1.6. It's actually a 56 millimeter f1.6, and this has like a soft focus, forced chromatic aberration, soft, beautiful glow around your subject, and it'll focus to half life size. It's a great 50 millimeter lens. I even used vintage 50s like I have on this Canon 7, the 50 1.2. This lens isn't super sharp. It's sharp enough, but it's not super sharp. But the bokeh on this is beautiful. It just renders amazing. It can be a little busy, but it can really make the shot too if you use it right. And I have an adapter for this to go on my EOS R, or I can shoot it with my Canon 7 on film. So 50s are just great. I love 50s. And I think every photographer should have at least one in their kit. My whole tale on 50s, the 50mm prime is definitely not past its prime. In fact, I think it's more important than ever before because a whole generation of photographers have come up with a kit zoom. We never had kit zooms back in the 70s and 80s. The kit lens was always a 50, usually an f2 or a 1.8 or 1.7 depending on the brand. You know, we would get zooms later when we needed a zoom lens, or we would get multiple prime lenses. But now today, so many cameras come with a kit zoom lens, and so many people just sort of skip the whole prime. You know, they get a 35-80 or a 28-80 or 24-105 or whatever kit lens, depending on the camera you buy. And then the next lens often that someone might buy would be a telephoto to get more reach. You know, and that might be an 80 to 200, whether it's a fast one like an f2.8 or a slower one like an f4 or even a 5.6. And then so many people, that's their kit. They run about their business and never really enjoy a high-speed prime, never really necessarily get an opportunity to kind of really play around with perspective other than just framing your shot with the zoom. So a prime lens can really be a powerful tool to help you become a better photographer, to help you really pay attention to elements in your frame that you might not pay attention to if you're just zooming in and out. And also to give you that extra speed without draining your wallet. You can get 1.8 speed in a 50 for chump change. And that allows you to do some of the creative stuff like isolating your subject from the background, which is something that becomes hard to do if you're shooting with, say, a 28 to 105 f5.6 or f4.5. Now don't forget, we've got PhotoFair coming up on the 22nd of this month, and this is a great place to find either vintage glass like this Zeiss Biotar or some similar vintage lens to give you just that amazing dreamy look that's really hard to duplicate in modern glass because modern glass is just so perfect. Or you can even pick up a modern 50 like a Canon 51.8, the so-called nifty 50, or from Nikon a 51.8 or a 51.4, used in good condition from reputable people at great prices. So it's a great way to come around, play around with things, bring your camera with you to the PhotoFair or any camera show that you go to anywhere in the country, because a lot of times you can test the lens out, especially if you've got a couple of adapters handy. Sometimes the guys working these shows have a bunch of adapters. You can put the lens on your camera, take a few shots, see what you think. So PhotoFair and other camera shows are wonderful to get out there and expand your photography. But don't ever think that the 50mm prime is past its prime, my friends. It is not. It is more relevant than ever before. I've got about 15 50s. So either I'm a kook or the 50 is still very much a viable product. It's probably a little bit of both. We'll see you at the next PhotoFair and right back here on YouTube for the next video. Thanks so much for watching.